Hello fellow gardeners. Today I dug up something really special in my backyard, my garlic and my potatoes. I've been waiting for months for this moment and I can't wait to share with you how I grew these beauties. Stick around for some tips and tricks, some funny moments, and of course this satisfying harvest at the end. I'm Patrina with Homegrown Florida. I'm glad you're here hanging out with me today because this is going to be a lot of fun. Let's start with the potatoes. I did my first planting of potatoes back in September. I was using the potatoes I had harvested last year as my seed potatoes. I was testing out if I could get a larger harvest by cutting my potatoes into pieces as opposed to the way I normally do it, which is to plant the whole potato. I had a lot of high hope for these guys, but it did not work out. Normally, potato plants take about 3 to 4 weeks before they emerge from the soil, so I was just waiting and waiting and waiting, and nothing ever happened. Not even one sprouted, which was super weird because all of them had eyes on them when I planted them, so something should have happened. Around the 6-week mark, I went digging down to see if I could find them and to see what was happening, and I could not find them anywhere. I know exactly where I put them because I filmed it, so I went back and I watched the video to figure out where exactly they were. So you can imagine my surprise when I could not find any pieces of those potatoes in that entire bed. I did notice these weird indentions in the ground, so my first thought was that an animal came through and pulled them out, but honestly, I'm now thinking they actually rotted. I did everything I was supposed to when I cut the potatoes. I let them scab over for several days, but it just didn't work out for me. I can't imagine that an animal would dig down and find every single piece of each potato and then carry them off or eat them right there without leaving any trace. So that kind of helped me rule that out. Also, I just didn't have super large animals that get into my fenced-in area. They could have eaten an entire pound, I think it might have been 2, of potatoes. I get birds and squirrels and the occasional rabbit, usually in my front yard. I don't typically see them in my backyard. So I just couldn't imagine that there was an animal large enough that had that kind of a feast. What I do remember is that we had a series of storms around that time, including a hurricane that dropped a significant amount of rain. So I think that just caused the beds to be too wet, and the fact that they were cut caused them to rot even easier in the ground. I'm still not 100% sure about that, but it's my best guess. By the time I gave up on that round of potatoes, we were already headed into our winter, and I knew if I planted them again, we do get a couple of frosts, and those frosts would kill any plants that had emerged. So I decided to wait until late January. I ordered 2 different kinds of seed potatoes, a Yukon Gold and a new variety, which is a russet, I think I'm going to pronounce it wrong, but Norcota variety. If you know the actual pronunciation, head down to the comments. But this one is a russet potato that produces in 90 days, which is very early for a russet and perfect for our area where we just have short growing seasons for white potatoes. I got these potatoes from Grand Teton Organics. It was a new producer that I hadn't used before, so I was trying them out, and they really were good quality. So I'll add the link in the description below. Now the seed potatoes I got were not very large. They were actually quite small, which I was fine with because I was planning on planting the whole potato. They also did not have any eyes on them when I got them, but when I planted them, they did fine. I didn't get very many of them since I wasn't sure what happened the first time. I wasn't sure if that would happen again and that they would get dug out by an animal again or that they would rot again. So I planted a very small amount, I think like 1 pound. And I planted that in late January, and like clockwork, they broke the surface in 3 weeks. And thankfully, we did not have any frosts after that popped up. They now have been going for 3 months, and as you can see, the plants are starting to look a little rough. They have blight, which is kind of funny to me since we have had such a bad drought and no water, no rain, and the humidity has been way down. So I'm a little surprised by the amount of blight. I wanted to get them pulled before the blight impacts the actual potatoes. This is another reason why I like growing them during the fall, because that normally just doesn't happen. Now, there are two ways to know when your potatoes are ready. The first thing I look for is flowers. My potatoes did produce flowers. It doesn't always happen, but mine did. And when I see those, I cut them off right away because I want the plant to focus on developing the roots and not developing flowers. But the flowers are telling you that the plant is mature. Once I cut them off, I waited 2 more weeks, and then I started to dig down at the base of the plant to see if I could find any roots. And at that point, you can just cover them back up and wait for them to get to the size that you want if they're not there yet. Now, I normally would wait a lot longer to harvest them, but given the blight, I just wanted to get them pulled up and out of there. My biggest takeaway from this planting was that I'm still a huge fan of the Yukon Gold for down here. They did produce the most amount of potatoes per plant, but they produced a lot of smaller ones too. I averaged about 4 good-sized potatoes and several of the little small ones. I like to call them my little nibbles. Now, the russet variety was not as productive. They produced 3 potatoes per plant. And weirdly enough, every single plant produced 3. There was no variation whatsoever. Every single plant gave me 3 potatoes, which was a little weird. At least they're consistent. I still like this variety though, because they do have a much thicker skin. So I'm guessing that they will last longer in storage than the Yukon Golds, because the Yukon Golds have a much thinner skin. And so they do tend to go bad faster. So my plan is I'm going to eat the Yukon Golds first, and I'll save the russets for later in the season. I really didn't get a lot of potatoes. This harvest was only 7 pounds of potatoes. I'm just happy I got any. And when you consider how many I planted the second round, I only planted 1 pound, and I got 7 pounds from that 1 pound. So I'm happy with it, but next year we're definitely going to be, taking some of the things that we learned and putting them into action for a much larger harvest. Now, the biggest benefit of this harvest was the learning opportunity. Going forward, I will always plant the potatoes whole. I know that a lot of people have great experience growing from cut seed potatoes, but I'm just not willing to chance that, especially with our weird and short seasons here. I have about 3.5 months in fall and 3.5 months in spring. Because the winter here, I get frost enough to kill them, so I've got to get them done before that. Or in summer, they start to die off, or they actually sprout, the potatoes underground. And so you got to get them out before it gets really hot and rainy. So because I have such a short time frame, I got to do what I know works every time. I also learned that I could grow a russet with a thick skin, so I'll definitely be doing that again. And I found a new supplier for seed potatoes, which I'm stoked about. I'm still going to grow in fall and spring, and hopefully I will have better outcomes compared to this year. Each year is different, and sometimes things just don't go as planned. Happens to every single one of us gardeners, so just roll with it and learn. Your likes and support mean the world to me, so if you're enjoying this video, please give it a thumbs up. Now let's jump right into the garlic, which went so well. Where the potatoes were a bit of a letdown, the garlic was the star of the garden. I planted 3 varieties back in late December. I also planted some garlic cloves that I had saved from my last year's harvest. I planted Susanville, Early Laura's, and Insulin Red. I also tried out a new supplier called Garlic Gods, and their seed garlic was spectacular, very healthy, and every single one of them sprouted. I also had good germination with my previously harvested garlic, but not the best results when it came to the heads, but we're going to get into that in just a few minutes. Last year, I struggled with feeding my plants. I actually ended up using a non-organic fertilizer, which was the only time I've done that in my garden. So I wanted to try something different this year to avoid that. I laid down 4 inches of compost, homemade compost, and I let it set in the beds for about 2 or 3 weeks before I planted my garlic. This was by far the best thing that I did for my garlic. Last year, I did lay down some black cow compost because I didn't have any of my own compost ready, and the results were so different. My homemade compost fed these plants the entire season, y'all. I never added a drop of fertilizer to these plants. I kept waiting and waiting to see if the plants were struggling for nutrients, and that just never happened. I was so stoked that compost alone was able to do this. That was my big takeaway, that I will always grow my garlic this way in the future. They all came up really strong and grew very tall and super green. In March, I started to notice that some of the lower leaves were starting to show some dead ends and browning, so I knew I was getting close to harvest time. Once I started to see a bit more of the browning happening on the lower leaves, I started to dig down to check the sizes of the heads. I wanted them to get as big as possible, so I just kept waiting until the plants looked pretty crappy. Then I just pulled up one, and I saw that one had a couple of cloves that had started to break away from the head. This can happen if you wait too long to harvest, so I decided to just go ahead and pull them. I got some great heads of garlic. Out of the 42 plants, I think I lost about 10 of them. So I ended up with a little over 30 heads of garlic. This is plenty for my husband and I. We use about a head a month in fresh garlic, and then we also use it minced later on in the season, and garlic powder we dry. I'll use the ones that broke away from the head first, since those probably won't last as long as the ones where the heads are whole. The very best ones that were the biggest and completely enclosed, I'll try and save those for next year to plant again in December. The smaller ones, I'll either dehydrate them to make garlic powder, or I'm going to mince them up and freeze them in olive oil to use later in the season once the larger ones are gone, or if they don't store well, which happens. Now let's talk varieties, because there was definitely a winner and a loser. The Insulum Red won the best variety in my garden last year, and it's going to hold its title this year. It was so good. My biggest heads are all Insulum Red. Barely any of them split, and all of them grew good sized heads. The Lors did okay as well. It's a bit smaller, and they were the ones that I noticed did the most splitting, the clove splitting. I'm sure there's an actual real term for that, but where one of the cloves kind of grows outside of the main head. I'll use those as my minced garlic, and I'll freeze them in oil and use them further on in the season. Now the Susanville, I think is this one right here. Oh, no, this is the Lors. Here's the Susanville. I'll show you a close-up, but the Susanville was the biggest loser. I had a lot of high hopes for this one. The heads are tiny. The cloves are almost non-existent. It might be that they needed longer, but you guys saw that the plants looked pretty dead, so they should have been ready. These will be the ones I will use to make garlic powder. I'll peel some of the outer layer of the paper once they're dry, and then I'll just slice them, the entire head, and dehydrate them, and then I'll grind them up with my coffee grinder to make our garlic powder for the year. I'm not going to try and peel each one of those cloves out. That would just be way too much work. The ones I saved from last year and planted that were super small, they did grow, and they grew well in the beginning, but they did eventually die off and they never produced. So I now know I need much larger cloves for those plantings. The smaller ones just aren't going to cut it. Next year, I will plant all Inchulum Red. I'm not going to fuss with any other varieties. It's a great tasting variety, a very traditional flavor, my go-to garlic from here on out. Now that we have them all harvested, I'm just going to let them all dry by hanging them together with string and hanging them from this pool gate. I've been leaving the fans on out here in my pool area so that they get good air movement. I'll leave them until the whole plant turns brown and crispy. For the nice big heads, I'm going to attempt to braid them and hang them in my pantry. I'm hoping that they will help keep the storage life longer than they did last year, because they only lasted about 3 or 4 months last year, and I'm sure that that was something I did wrong. I am so happy with how these turned out. I'm also grateful for the potato harvest, even if it was a bit smaller than I would like. I hope you enjoyed seeing my garlic and potato harvest. If you want to watch my step-by-step guide to growing garlic, check out this video next. Happy gardening, guys!